carburetor on your motorcycle uses mechanical systems to mix fuel and air together at a very specific ratio perfectly every time. In a perfect world, this would be great and we'd never have to look at fuel injection, but unfortunately, because fuel is dirty, there's certain sediments in it. As it evaporates, it leaves a certain varnish behind. A lot of these small jets that it uses actually get clogged up over time. To understand a carburetor, you need to know how it works. So the first thing I'm going to do is quickly disassemble one and show you how everything fits together and what they do, and then we can look at the carburetor as a whole. A carburetor on a motorcycle sits like this. The bottom end to me and the top end away from me. Okay, this is a Mikuni CV carb, or constant velocity carb. It's one of the more complex carbs you can get, and it's still quite simple to understand. So we're just going to quickly start taking it apart. The section I'm removing now is a float bowl, or a fuel bowl, and this is where fuel sits. It has a screw at the bottom, and that's to drain the fuel out of it if you're not going to be riding a motorcycle for a long time. Inside your bowl, you have a float, which is this big black thing here. And as your fuel increases in the fuel bowl, the float will rise up, and that will close off a needle and seat, which is a type of fuel valve. Okay, there's a small tab on your float, and that tab sits on a needle. Some of them are brass, some of them are stainless steel. We have a stainless steel type here. They're often spring-loaded so that there's a good amount of force sealing off this needle and seat, and that's what stops fuel coming into your carb if it's already full of fuel. That needle lives in the seat and is a matched set, so you have to change one with the other. Just hold in place with that. If we take it out, you can see there's this very small filter on top of it, and that filter is a last chance filter. So it's the very last filter that's going to get any dirt or grit out of your fuel before it comes into your carb. If we have a closer look, we can see these two big standoffs here. Now this is for your main jet and your pilot jet. Let's start off with the pilot jet because it's much smaller. Your pilot jet is designed to supply fuel to your engine and mix it with air at a low RPM. And when I say low RPM, I normally just mean from about idle to about a quarter throttle. Okay? If you look in there, you can see a very small hole, and that hole is the maximum amount of fuel that can flow through this jet. Okay, the holes on the sides are for emulsion, and that means it just mixes fuel and air together before it leaves the top. Needle jet. Your needle jet is adjusted very, very finely by your mixture screw, which is on top over here. Now this mixture screw, depending on where it is in a carburetor, will either adjust the amount of fuel going to the engine at idle, or it will adjust the amount of air going to your engine at idle. If that screw is on the engine side, it's a fuel screw, and if it is on the air side, it is an air screw. And what I mean by that is, if we look here, the mixture screw is at the top there, and this goes to the engine, and this comes from your airbox. If this screw is on the left-hand side, so closest to the engine, when you screw it in, it will limit the amount of fuel going to your engine, and if it is on the airbox side and you screw it in, it will limit the amount of air going to your engine. This is quite critical when it comes to tuning these carbs and setting them up, but we'll get to that in servicing. The needle, as you can see, that is used to adjust the fuel and air mixture ratio at idle, comes to a very fine point, okay? And when this is screwed all the way in, it seals off the fuel completely, so your bike will die if that's screwed all the way in. We use this needle to adjust for very small changes in your mixture settings. So if, for instance, you go on holiday and you go down to the coast, you'll maybe screw that out slightly to allow more fuel to come into your engine because there's more air down at the coast. The next jet we're going to look at is your main jet. Your main jet works in exactly the same way as your pilot jet, but it's much bigger. Okay, you can see it'll have a much bigger hole in the center. And again, that allows the maximum amount of fuel to flow into your engine. A lot of people think your main jet is the thing responsible for how your engine runs, but it actually only really comes into effect at high RPMs. So from about 3/4 throttle up to maximum throttle. Okay? That's all the things that are important at the bottom section of the carb. If we start looking at the top of the carb, we can see the thing that makes the CV carb so fancy, and that is the diaphragm and spring setup. Take this cover off slowly. There's a spring which keeps the slide and diaphragm pushed all the way down. I can just take that all the way out. If we have a look here, you can see this silver thing here is called a slide, okay? And this black rubber thing is called a diaphragm. This slide itself is quite interesting in its design. It has a needle which is flowing out the bottom of it. Let me just upend that and show you guys quickly. This needle is responsible for the fuel mixture from anywhere from quarter throttle all the way up to 3/4 throttle. So it's quite an important adjustment, and we'll get to that a little bit later. If you look at the actual slide, you can see 2 holes, the big one in the center for the needle, and a small one to allow air pressure to move from the bottom of this slide here to on top of the diaphragm. Okay, so if we put this back in this carb just to show you guys quickly, we can see that the bottom of the slide is sitting in that carb throat. So all the air pressure in the carb throat acts above the diaphragm. Okay, that's quite important because these carburetors work on air pressure to adjust the fuel and air ratio, unlike a normal slide carb, where the slide is actually just connected directly to a throttle cable. On one of these Mikuni carburetors, it's connected to a butterfly valve, which I've removed here so you guys can see properly. But as you increase your throttle, the butterfly valve opens, allowing more air to flow into the engine. Underneath the diaphragm, you can see a big opening over here, and that opening is connected to the airbox side of your carb. So as air is flowing into your carb, it pressurizes the area below the diaphragm. So what happens is, as you start accelerating, the butterfly valve will open slightly. As air starts coming into your carburetor, you end up with an increase in pressure through that hole, which, remember, acts below the diaphragm over there, pushes the slide up, and at the same time, as air is moving through the throat of your carburetor, which is this very thin section in the center, because of its a convergent and then divergent duct, the air pressure actually decreases. So there's a slight vacuum inside your carburetor where the slide is. Because of that, there's a slight vacuum above the diaphragm, which pulls up the slide. And as the slide comes up, it no longer rests perfectly in the emulsion tube. And that emulsion tube, we can take out now quickly. That emulsion tube sits on top of your main jet. Okay, so if we were to reassemble this quickly, so you guys can see what I'm talking about. Your main jet is here at the bottom, which supplies fuel to your engine. It comes through this emulsion tube, and remember, if you look at these two jets, they actually look quite similar. Okay, they both have sections which can mix the fuel and the air together, and they both have small fuel holes at the very bottom. So they're doing exactly the same thing, one's just much bigger. The needle, that normally lives in your float, in your slide, sorry, lives inside that emulsion tube. And when your throttle is entirely closed and your slide is all the way down, it's sealed off perfectly. Yeah. As you start increasing your throttle, the needle starts coming out, and there's a small gap between the emulsion tube and the needle. Let's get a close-up of that quickly. A small gap between the emulsion tube and the needle, allowing fuel to start flowing out that emulsion tube. This is what allows your carburetor to mix more fuel with more air, so that depending on if it's a hot day or a cold day, the air pressure acting on the diaphragm will determine exactly how much fuel is coming into your engine. Now, a lot of people, if they're doing a cafe race or a mod on a bike, they want to change their jets because they want to put pod filters on. You can change your jets, and you often have to, but don't forget that you also need to change your needle height, and that's most likely the thing that's going to give you an issue. If you look at your needle, and we have a little close-up here, there's a small circlip with multiple grooves on that needle. As you move the circlip down slightly, you're going to lift the needle slightly higher in the actual emulsion tube, and by doing that, you're going to enrich in the mixture, so allow more fuel to flow into the engine for a certain amount of air.